You're listening to the Jefferson Exchange. Thanks for joining us. The JX starts today with a debrief where JPR reporters discuss the stories they've been covering this week, including a lawsuit against a carbon credit startup, innovative ways to explore the world in Arcata, and financial problems at Southern Oregon University. I'm Roman Battaglia, science, energy, and politics reporter.
And I'm Jane Vaughn, housing, homelessness, and education reporter.
Half of our staff is out, but
Yes.
earlier this week, news director Maria Carter spoke with public health and safety reporter Justin Higginbottom about his story on a carbon credit startup with deep ties to Northern California.
Justin, you have a story about some controversy around a company which sells carbon credits to fund reforestation. That really sounds like a good mission, right?
Yeah, it does. So before I get into the controversy, let me just tell you about the company. It's called Mast Reforestation, and it's a startup based in Seattle, but they have projects in Northern California, kind of in our backyard. And they want to combat climate change by replanting land burned by wildfire. So Mast's idea is to pay for this by selling voluntary carbon credits. These are financial instruments that companies buy to offset their emissions. And Mast kind of made waves in the press and in the green investment world when they started. They got backing from Social Capital, which is a Silicon Valley venture capital firm. Mast also bought key parts of the supply chain for reforestation, including CalForest Nurseries. That's in Etna, and that's actually the largest independent nursery in the Pacific Northwest.
Well, let's get into the controversy. As you report, this has to do with the kind of credits Mast is selling. Why is that?
Right. So importantly, Mast sells what's called ex-ante credits for its reforestation. And that means companies are purchasing offsets which represent emission reductions in the future, which makes sense when you're funding reforestation because the trees that will reduce carbon aren't there yet. But because these ex-ante credits are kind of bets on future carbon reductions, they're more risky. And these projections can be especially risky when you're dealing with reforestation in the West, which can see drought or harsh weather or, like we mentioned, wildfire.
In your story, you report about a lawsuit in Siskiyou County against Mast, and that lawsuit has to do with these ex-ante carbon credits?
Right. So a former employee of Mast sued the company this spring. It's a wrongful termination lawsuit, which is usually not too interesting, but it includes some pretty damning claims against Mast's CEO, Grant Canary. It says the CEO, quote, frequently lied about Mast's business to outside clients and investors. That includes implying a well-known corporation would purchase a large percentage of its carbon credits. He also allegedly really overestimated the value of these offsets. And the lawsuit claims employees, even Canary himself, knew this all wasn't true, but the goal was to kind of secure these partnerships and investments for the company.
You report that the carbon credit market is facing sort of an integrity problem. This probably doesn't help that, does it?
Right. So over the last few years, there's been a lot of scrutiny of this market. And last year, actually, there was a study in Nature Communications which found less than 16% of carbon credits actually lead to emission reductions. Those were just the projects the authors looked at, but it doesn't paint a pretty picture. Mast won't comment on the lawsuit, but they said the market has gone through what they say is a period of reckoning in recent years. And they don't see that as a bad thing, according to the statements they provided to us. They say it's helping raise the bar for carbon removal projects like theirs.
Well, how are Mast's reforestation projects actually going?
Yeah, that's the thing. So the company said it has replanted a lot of land in Montana and California, although Carbon Streaming, which is a company that invested in Mast, has marked down the value of the credits at those locations actually to zero. So although the replanting happened, it's not clear it's worth anything to those wanting carbon credits. I did speak to some former employees for this story. No one wanted their names used because they're scared of getting sued, but they confirmed that Mast CEO was overinflating the value of these carbon credits. Although one employee said, they truly believe in the voluntary carbon credit model to help combat climate change. That's why they were working for the company. They're just hoping that some bad actors don't discredit the whole thing.
Well, Justin, thank you so much for your reporting.
Thank you.
Roman, we're going to turn to you next. You just published a story today about a hall of simulation at Cal Poly Humboldt in Arcata. First, what is a hall of simulation?
Yeah, I know that you had mentioned this yesterday. You were like, I'm really curious about this story. What is a hall of simulation? So, it's not necessarily something everyone should know about. It's not like a thing It's this special space at the Cal Poly Humboldt Library where they have a bunch of these different kinds of simulators. So they have like a flight simulator and this emergency simulation table, which can simulate wildfires and floods and like smoke events if like a chemical leak from a plant escapes or something and all this stuff. There's like a sandbox experiment where like, you can move the sand around and it will simulate different heights and stuff. It's got a mini wind tunnel. It's got a 3D herbarium. It's got all these different things that are kind of designed to simulate the real world and make you feel like you're there. And a lot of them were actually created by students at Cal Poly Humboldt. So they're all kind of in one space there at the library.
Super cool. Okay, so yeah, I hadn't heard of this before, but it is basically exactly what it
Yeah,
sounds like.
exactly.
So what is the goal of the Hall of Simulation?
Yeah, so the library dean there had kind of brought together a bunch of different things they had collected. They had some, different simulators, and he was kind of wanting to create a special space to put them all together. The goal is to kind of inspire both students, but also community members as well, and then to kind of inspire learning throughout the library. You'll kind of notice if you go there that it's very open. It's not just like it's in a room. It's like right next to all of the books. And he said that, he put this hall next to all of these book stacks for a reason.
The technology might draw people to the library, but really the books is what helps add the tremendous amount of learning that you can do in all the disciplines. We have 500,000 books, and so when students or community members or families are in the Hall of Simulation, they literally can walk into the book collection and start to learn about the books that we have.
Yeah, so he kind of wants to use these simulators as a way to draw people into the library. He has a bunch of other ideas about kind of making this library a more modern and engaging place. One thing is sort of like bringing the book collections to life, sort of, where like in the book stacks themselves, he took me on a tour where they're starting to like put posters up where like this poster shows different kinds of sea animals, and like that's the stack right there is where you can find books about sea animals, or like have a model of human hair like follicle or something to show you what it looks like, and like right there is like books about human anatomy and stuff, so kind of like being more engaging. And this hall kind of acts like a science museum because there really isn't one nearby. There is a science museum in Eureka, but it's more designed for children, and it's not as like impressive or modern as like one in San Francisco or Portland or something like that. So we talked about the story and the goals to kind of connect the students and community members. Often these college libraries can be really separate. Cal Poly Humboldt is like literally separated by a highway between Arcata and the rest of the place. So the dean is really trying to make an effort to invite the community in to use this space in the library.
Super cool. Okay, so really trying to integrate the learning with the books and the Hall of Simulation and the community and the college. So what did you learn when you went down there?
Yeah, I mean, I learned a lot of stuff. I learned a lot, especially about the aviation club and this flight simulator they have. They got this flight simulator about a year ago. It was a donation from this rich guy who had it at his house, and he was getting a new one and wanted to get rid of this old one, so just donated it to the college. It's like hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's really, really cool. It like recreates this Cessna 182 plane, which is a pretty small plane, and I actually got to fly it while I was there, and it felt like really real. I was like actually legitimately nervous taking off, worried I was going to crash or something. And it even has like a working radio with a real person who like the company pays for to like simulate ground control and stuff. And a lot of other cool tools. There's cool stuff there at the library, like the 3D herbarium was also a thing I didn't really get to talk about in the story, which is created by computer science students to model native plants in the area. They use something called photogrammetry, which takes hundreds of photos of a plant all around it, and it's like a better way to document and preserve this plant than the original method, which is like flattening and preserving it that way. You can see all of the details and all of the 3D parts of the plant. And the student who actually spearheaded the project was then hired by the library to continue doing it, which is really cool. And this plant library, you can actually go see online right now. They have it available online as well. So there's lots of the projects like this are student projects that the dean kind of challenges students to create. And so it's giving students a chance to work on real life projects and things that they're learning in school, but then it also creates new experiences for the Hall of Simulation. Like they have this small wind tunnel that simulates or shows how wind flies over the flaps of a wing. And so it's near the flight simulator. So if a flight instructor's there, they can like show a student like, oh, here's how, the wind is actually moving. And when you turn the flaps, like here's how the wind goes over this wing. So it kind of adds to the experience.
Yeah, really cool. So what does the library dean have planned next for this Hall of Simulation?
Yeah, so a big part of this story was about connecting this hall with the local community. It's still a pretty new space, and I think a big part of it is that, a lot of the tools and experiences there might be hard for someone to understand how they can use it in real life, like this emergency simulation table. Like how can someone who's not a wildland firefighter or an emergency manager or something use this tool or this dissection table? How can people who aren't nursing students use this? And so they're trying to, get the community use this space more, and piloting these workshops this summer to kind of show people like how could this be a helpful tool for you, or how can you explore this? And they're going to have more staff on staff starting in the summer and in the fall to have weekend hours and late night hours so that like families can come and they can learn more how to use them, because some of these tools do take some learning to use. The flight simulator itself is really popular. There's a lot of hours logged on that, but that specifically is sort of like an outlier, and so they're trying to make sure that people know about the whole hall and how else they can use all of these things.
Yeah, trying to get the community more involved for sure. Well, thanks for your reporting, Roman. If our listeners are interested, there's a great story on our website at ijpr.org. You can read the full story there, all of Roman's reporting, and there's some pretty cool photos as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Jane, you wrote a story this week about more budget problems here at Southern Oregon University in Ashland. What's happening there?
Yeah, so basically the problem for SOU is that the school is going to be getting less money from the state than they had previously expected. The state of Oregon has not technically adopted its budget quite yet, but our SOU president, Rick Bailey, says that he has a pretty good idea of what they're going to be getting, and basically says that it means about a $3.3 million shortfall for the university for the upcoming fiscal year, which starts in July, so it's coming up pretty quickly. President Rick Bailey says that there is inadequate state support, and there's sort of an expectation that, schools can just increase their tuition to raise money and to fill in those gaps. But he really worries about the burden financially then falling on the students. And so he says they're not going to do that. He doesn't want to do that. SOU already increased their tuition for most students last April. And so here we are. He doesn't want to increase the tuition again. So as a result, getting less money than expected, $3.3 million shortfall. SOU might have to cut programs and potentially up to 35 positions because of this. And that's what President Bailey had sent out an email to faculty and staff to announce that.
Interesting. So it sounds like there's sort of like a struggle between, what the state is expecting, saying, you can just raise more tuition. But like, we have seen that like schools keep raising tuition, and it's discouraging people from coming to college and, going to university. So I know that SOU has already dealt with some financial crisis in recent years, though, right?
Yeah. So the university has faced a lot of financial problems in recent years. At one point, they had projected a $13 million budget deficit, and that prompted the creation of this new fiscal realignment plan, they called it. That was 2 years ago. It was called SOU Forward. And that plan involved cutting almost 82 positions. Most of it was by not filling job vacancies, retirements, voluntary departures, non-renewable contracts. But there were about 24 employees who were laid off. SOU has also struggled recently with a decline in enrollment, which President Bailey says was basically due to a late rollout of the Federal Financial Student Aid Form, the FAFSA. And so this is really a little bit more of a financial shortfall than they were expecting. Last fall, SOU had projected a $2.8 million budget shortfall for the upcoming fiscal year. Now we're at about 3.3. So it's not hugely larger, but it is more.
Yeah, that's interesting that it's a larger deficit. But it also looks like that he mentioned that they're not going to be cutting as many, at least positions.
Well, we don't really know yet. Like I said, with SOU Forward, there was a lot of not filling job vacancies, attrition. Bailey says it's not going to be that easy this time around because we've already done a bunch of cuts. And so now he says the decisions are going to involve people who probably don't want to leave SOU. So that's going to be really tough. But nothing has been decided at this point yet. Which cuts are going to happen, we don't really know. The university is going to create a plan to fill the budget deficit in the coming months. So that's kind of of all to be determined. So the university's Board of Trustees is scheduled to meet a week from today, next Friday, to consider their budget for the new fiscal year. And then after that, the college is going to work on this funding shortfall problem and what cuts might have to be made.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Jane. We'll have to kind of keep an eye on what happens
For
there.
sure.
That's going to be it for the debrief this week. Thanks for listening. You can reach the newsroom with comments on our coverage and suggestions for things we should cover in the future through our news tip line. It's on our website at ijpr.org. And you can find this program and more at jeffexchange.org or subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform.